All right. Well, we are to give you all just a minute on Revelation chapter 12. So that is chapter 12. So, like I said before, we've made good progress. We are now in the second half of the book of Revelation. Past that, it's 22 chapters, and we're now into 12. But not only the halfway point, just in terms of like chapters and verses, but we've also hit a big sort of shift in the story Revelation and the way that it's going to be told. The first half of Revelation talked a lot about God and evil in very broad strokes. It was lots of stories of God taking on these personified but still sort of immaterial evils and dealing with them sort of quickly and decisively. Um, the second half of the book is going to be more pointed. If the first half of the book is about evil in broad strokes, the second half of the book is where we start to name names, so to speak. It's more direct. Like the first half, we're still looking at a story about God overcoming evil in the world and overcoming Satan's power over the world. But the story from here on out is going to be more detailed and more dramatic than it has been before, if you can believe that. And really, the big change is that the church's role in this overcoming of evil is going to become one of the primary concerns. And you'll see what that means soon. It's where Revelation starts to get really practical, so to speak, where it really starts to put forward kind of material concerns and expectations for what the church should be doing right now. Um, but saying all that, that might not be immediately clear tonight. I promised you guys last week that tonight we got a story about a dragon, and that's always fun. And it's sort of setting the stage for what's going to come sooner. That this is going to give us another kind of story or way of understanding why Satan has power in the world right now. And it's going to do that to kind of set up what the believers should be doing about it. But we're only going to really get that set up tonight. Um, and we're going to get it in a really, really interesting way. Basically, what tonight's chapter is a subversive play on one of Rome's national myths. So if you were to scan the chapter ahead, you might see the quick outline that it's a story where a woman is about to give birth and a dragon is going to come and devour the woman and her child. But God pulls the woman up away and saves the child. And then the child is prophesied to defeat the dragon. And we're going to talk and kind of get through what all these individual symbols mean, but there's one kind of big thing that's maybe helpful to keep in mind. And that's that this story we're going to get tonight is really playing with one of Rome's kind of foundational myths. So the god Apollo is one of the most important gods in the Roman pantheon. And one of the reasons that he's important is that he was a god that was really closely associated with emperors, so much that he was the favorite god of Augustus Caesar, who claimed to be Apollo's son, the son of God. You can still find coins with those words minted on it, with the implication that Augustus Caesar, Julius Caesar's adoptive son, was the son of Apollo, the son of God. And so, because of this, Apollo was especially associated with whoever the current Caesar was, whether they claimed direct lineage from Apollo like Augustus did, or just claimed that they were really being influenced by Apollo. Apollo is really a symbol for the Caesar and for Rome itself. And one of the most famous stories about Apollo is actually the story of his birth. And it's going to sound really familiar after we get done with tonight's chapter. So, according to this ancient myth for Rome, when Apollo's mother, Leto, I believe, was pregnant with Apollo and about to give birth, another goddess sent a dragon to attack her. The dragon's name was Python, and that's what the animal's named after. But this terrible dragon gets sent to chase down and kill Apollo's mother before she can give birth. But the goddess narrowly escapes and she gives birth to a child, and that child is Apollo. And in fact, as a child, still not fully grown up, Apollo gets revenge on the dragon by tracking it down and then killing it. So Revelation 12 is a retelling of this story about the emperor's favorite deity, but it's recasting all the roles, as we're going to see. It's a dragon chasing a pregnant woman, but this time the child's not Apollo. And the child's not Apollo who's going to come and inspire the Caesar and make Rome great when he kills the dragon. The child is Christ, the one that Caesar tried and failed to kill, and the one who's going to ultimately dethrone Caesar. In this version of the story, the emperor isn't the heroic descendant of the hero. The emperor is a lackey of the dragon. It sort of reminds me of what happened with the song and the tune Dixie during the Civil War. You might know I'd spend a lot of time looking into like old folk music and kind of tracking down how it develops. And this is always an interesting one to me where this song, Dixie, you may know the tune, was written and started out in the South as a song about how great it was to live in the South and how important it was to defend the South during the Civil War. But Union soldiers, after hearing it, rewrote the song, and they kept the same tune, but they gave it new words to be about the evils of slavery and the inevitability of Uncle Sam ending those evils. And they sort of rewrote the song as Union Dixie, and it became really popular. And that's kind of what's going on in tonight's chapter. An old song is being rewritten to have an entirely different meaning than the original. So let's get into it. Look at chapter 12. Get my light here. So we begin with John getting a new vision. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head was a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on its head. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. But she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. So we get this story. This woman described with this almost magic-like appearance, clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and wearing a crown of stars, is giving birth, and a dragon wants to come and devour her child, but God protects the child and the woman. So we're obviously dealing with something really symbolic here. We're getting into kind of an allegory territory here. But I think the signs are fairly easy to kind of pin together if we look at some of the way that these things are used in Revelation and the Bible. So simply put, the woman represents God's people. First Israel, and then this combination of Israel expanded to include the church. But the woman represents God's people, whether that be Israel or the church. And that's kind of an easy one because throughout Revelation, stars keep getting used to mean the church. All the way back in the first chapter, you might remember in 1:16, one of the visions is explicitly explained. John sees Jesus holding up 7 stars, and he's told that the 7 stars are the 7 churches. So we see this woman clothed in stars. We understand her as being the church in Israel in sort of a little bit of a difficult time since, but she's God's people, and she's giving birth to clearly a stand-in for Christ. Right, the faithful, someone is going to come out of this community of God's people who is going to be a male child who will rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And the dragon wants that to not happen. So the image here is that the faithful community, first Israel, will out of it come the savior, the Messiah that's going to rule the nation, and the dragon wants to stop that. And we know the dragon is bad because we know the dragon is Satan because that's just a really consistent symbol in the Old Testament. You never get good. There are no good dragons in the Bible, and there may be more times where dragons are mentioned than you might think. In figures of speech, dragons are talked about in Psalm 74, Psalm 89, Isaiah 30, Isaiah 51, Ezekiel 29. All these have visions of terrible dragons, and in all those contexts, they always mean Satan and the forces of evil, essentially. So we have the God's community um, preparing to have come out of it the Messiah. And the dragon wants to stop that from happening because the dragon is the child will dethrone him, right? Christ will defeat Satan. Um, but the dragon, Satan, isn't able to stop the child from being born. God saves the child, and we sort of telescope here where the dragon is defeated when the child is born. The child sort of represents Christ in his whole life, his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection. This all comes out of Israel and then expands to include the church. And as much as Satan, the great dragon, wants to stop it, he can't stop it. Just to get some of the weird images too, he has 7 heads and 10 horns. You might remember the lamb that showed up in, I believe, chapter 4 or 5 was described as looking like that also. Um, and we said that 7 is completeness and 10 is sort of all encompassing completeness because it's 7 and 3 together. And so the idea here is that the dragon has complete oppressive power. The dragon has this sort of false crown. He's claiming ownership over all of creation, but he's thwarted. God protects the child, and he protects the woman too. And then it says, the child is brought up to be with God at his throne. So we understand that as being Christ's ascension, kind of being talked about here in this dramatic picture. And the woman is brought to a place in the wilderness where she can be protected and nourished by God for 1,260 days. So there's a few symbols going on here. Wilderness in the Bible is a place of testing really often. So think that when Jesus is going to be tempted by the devil, what does he do? He goes to the wilderness. When Israel leaves Egypt and has to sort of prove their faithfulness for a bit before settling into the promised land, where is Israel wandering? They're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But also, wilderness can be a place of protection and provision. So think like Elijah when when King Ahab and Queen Jezebel are trying to kill Elijah. God brings him to the wilderness and has ravens bring him food and a spring come up to give him water. And that's the image being drawn on here, that God's people might be tested now, but they're going to be protected. God is bringing them to a place of safety. And it says for 1,260 days. If your memory is really good for numbers, you might remember we've had this come up a couple times now, this phrase 1,260 days. And that's 3.5 years or 42 months. And we talked about this last time, but to refresh because it's been a week, we said that that number 3.5 years really kind of means in Revelation a limited span of time, right? If 7 is completeness or eternity, 3.5 is not that. It's the sort of opposite of that. It's something that's time bound. And we also said that it can also have kind of an ominous connotation in the Bible because 3.5 years is 42 months. And 42 is kind of for Israel like our 13, like that's the kind of bad number. But the more important thing is it's a limited span of time that after the Messiah is victorious, God protects his people for a span of time, not eternally. It's not that God's protection is going to lap, but as we're going to see coming forward, the dragon will soon no longer be a threat. And as long as the dragon is a threat for this limited span of time, God is protecting God's people. He's protecting this woman in the wilderness. And so then we see kind of the consequences of this in 7. And a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So the birth of this child and the taking of the child up to God, which we said is sort of a symbol for Christ's work in the world, that the faithful community is successful, and that Christ comes forward and does his work. Um, that's accompanied by a war in heaven where the dragon and his angels fight against Michael and God's angels, and they lose. The dragon loses, and he's thrown out of heaven. Satan is defeated because of the work of Christ in this allegory that we have here, and Satan is thrown out of heaven, unable to dethrone God and to dethrone Christ like he was wanting to, because of the victory of the angels and the faithful on earth. And we know this because of what's going to follow. That'll be important. That we're going to have a song come up soon that's going to say that in part, this war that Satan loses is a joint effort of God's faithful community on earth and the angels sort of working together to secure Satan's defeat. It's kind of an interesting image. It kind of gives us power, so to speak. It makes us actors in the overthrow of evil. I've mentioned a few times now a short commentary on Revelation I really like called Comfort and Protest, The Apocalypse of John from a South African Perspective by Alan Bosak, South African Presbyterian, I believe, minister. And I wanted to pull him back here because it's really good. He's the one you might remember that was a preacher during apartheid who did a lot of organizing and protest efforts and was jailed for it. And he wrote this commentary while he was in jail. And so, reflecting on his experiences, he writes a full chapter, which is kind of unusual for his short book, on this story of the dragon. And I'm going to refer to him a few times tonight, but this one really got me. So from his commentary, talking about this battle in heaven, God refuses to remain aloof while God's people are locked in a battle with the forces of evil. God becomes passionately involved when God's people suffer and struggle for the sake of the truth. And when they cry out, the heavens are disturbed. It is not true that the peace and bliss of heaven cannot be turned into battle as some claimed. John is saying exactly the opposite. The heavens are disturbed, even as Jesus was torn when he saw the suffering of God's people in the world. Over and over, the Bible rejoices in the truth that God cannot and will not simply stand on the sidelines and remain neutral. Neutrality is leaving things up to the dragon. No, taking the side of the dragon. And so, in the struggle for peace, for justice, for humanity, and the true life of the church and of the world, God has taken sides, becomes involved, and makes war on behalf of God's people. And this war we have in this story is victorious, and it leads to a song. So to go in 10, we have now the voices in heaven singing this song of victory about the defeat of the dragon. So starting in 10, and then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell within them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So we get this song of praise, and it's an interesting one. One of the things that really struck out to me is verse 11 here. That they talking about the church. So we just had this image where the angels in heaven are fighting a war against evil. But then when they're talking about the victory, they say they have conquered him. They say, but they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. That's talking about the church here, that the church's faithfulness during persecution somehow, I almost hate to say empowers the angels because I don't want to sound dualistic. But the church really participates in the downfall of Satan, that in this cosmic war that happens, the church's faithfulness matters, and the church's faithfulness contributes to the conclusion, which is the victory of God and God's people over the dragon, over Satan. Bosak writes here again something I really like, talking about this song in heaven. So I'm going to read a little bit of a longer excerpt, but I think it's worth it. of him talking a little bit about his own experiences and victory and song in South Africa. And now again, there is a song of praise. Many make the mistake of interpreting this song, as they do the other songs in this book, in a purely triumphalistic fashion. Others ask if it is not premature to sing when the battle is not yet over, and neither view is quite correct. Oppressed people in South Africa understand the need for singing. Sometimes a song is a song of triumph, celebrating a success, expressing hope the ultimate victory will come. It is a song of anticipation. Other songs express mourning, ask painful questions that cannot easily be answered. Still other songs simply express the reality of the situation. This reality is not merely discussed or analyzed intellectually, it is sung, and by being sung, is brought into the sharpest focus not only of the minds but also of our hearts. Such a song is the Song of Revelation 12. This song has nothing to do with the shallow, triumphalistic Jesus is the answer theology with which oppressed people are so often taught to comfort themselves. Neither is it premature, for the battle is won, even though the struggle is not yet over. And besides, it drives the dragon crazy when you sing about his downfall, even though you were bleeding. And I really like that last part. And its point there of the song not only being triumph but almost defiance is that the devil is defeated here, but in his defeat, he's thrown out of heaven and to the earth. And that sort of carries its implication with it for how we think of ourselves right now. And so it goes on in verse 13. Sorry, I should back up just a little bit before this. Bosak goes on in his commentary to call this song the blessed paradox of Revelation. That the people are celebrating because Satan has been denied any chance of victory over creation. That we're celebrating because in being thrown from heaven and being defeated by God and the angels and Michael, Satan can no longer win in this battle for creation. But because of that, Satan is going to really turn his focus into just doing harm and harming God's people. And so Bosak, like I said, calls this the blessed paradox in Revelation here. He says, even as the church rejoices in the first victory, it prepares for difficult days ahead. The devil has come down in great wrath because he is lost, but also because he knows his time is short. And precisely because his time is short, he will now do as much damage as he can. And that's what the chapter goes on to talk about, starting in 13. So when I saw that the dragon had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to her place where she would be nourished for a time, and 2 times, and half a time. That expression times there would mean like months or years usually, but it's an expression that means essentially the same thing we said earlier: 3.5 years, a year, 2 year, and half a year. So that same kind of limited time span. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to help the woman. It opened up its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth. And the dragon was angry with the woman, and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. So then, in this final, or I guess one more verse in 18, then the dragon took its stand on the sand of the seashore. And that will take us into 13, which we won't read tonight. The dragon is defeated and can no longer accomplish its goal, but the dragon still exists. It's been thwarted in its plan, but not necessarily killed. I don't think the image here is that Satan can be killed in the way we might think of it, but all that aside, Satan, according to this passage, is still present on earth precisely because he no longer has any say or ability in heaven. If he was trying to dethrone God, to take over creation, the opportunity for that has passed, and now all he can do is take his anger out on God's faithful and on creation itself. It's interesting here in 14 and 15 that as the dragon pursues the woman and sprays, a river out of its mouth, the earth actually comes to the woman's aid. That creation is on the side of God's people and not the side of the dragon. But the dragon still has a very limited, very particular kind of power. He can no longer accomplish his goal, and so he rages against God's people here. Right? He is pursuing the children of the woman, and explicitly says, "Those who keep the commandments of God and hold their testimony." With the limited amount of time he has left, because after this defeat, we're going to see later in the book, it's inevitable that Satan is going to be locked away and thrown away forever, with his little time, with his time 2 times and half a time, with his 3.5 years, so to speak. He wants to do as much harm as possible because he can't win anymore. And this, for Revelation, we're going to see as we go on into the book, is the reason that God's people are experiencing trials and tribulations in the world. Satan, though defeated, is trying to cause damage and harm to God's creation and as much suffering as he can, especially for God's people. He can't win anymore, but he can try and make things bad for other people. He can try and mess up what God has won. We experience suffering because of this, but we remember in our suffering that this thrashing that the dragon is doing is futile. The end of the dragon, like what's going to happen to him ultimately, and our end, what happens to us ultimately, is already decided. The dragon can't do anything, I guess, substantive, even though he might. He can harm us, he can harm the body, he can make life hard, but our eternal destination is secure. God has secured creation for himself in Christ, and that's not going to be defeated by anything that the devil is capable of doing anymore, no matter how painful it might be to experience that now. And on a concluding note, I want to read from just a different commentary N.T. writes on Revelation that I've used a few times as he's talking on this passage. I thought this put it really well. The decisive battle has been won, and the devil knows it. But his basic nature of accuser is now driving him, and more frantically, to the attack, to accuse wherever it's justified, and wherever it isn't, to drag down, to slander, to vilify, to deny the truth of what the Creator God and his Son, the Lamb, have accomplished and are accomplishing. This is the ongoing battle in which all Christians are engaged, whether they know it or not. So this is how Revelation from here on out is going to picture the world. Satan is defeated, but he still has time to mess things up. And in the next chapter, we're going to see more about exactly how he tries to go about that. But for now, I think it's helpful to stop and think about this idea that Revelation gives us, that our sufferings are here only because the final victory of the Lamb is assured. This is Satan thrashing about because he can't do anything else, because he can't win anymore. And even though that means that we'll go through suffering and persecution, I think it's a comforting thought at the end of the day, because the outcome of all of that is settled. So thank you all for joining me. I'm looking forward to some of my kind of favorite chapters of Revelation coming up next. Next week we get the beast, sort of the famous one, the beast that comes out of the earth. We get his number 666. So probably lots of the big questions people have about Revelation. We'll see if we can solve all of that next week. But thank you all for being here, and looking forward to any discussion we might have.